since this is recorded, then whoever is late will be able to catch up later. So I'm seeing our guests on the panel this day already turning their cameras on. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to this event called Degrowth and Climate Justice, a debate with ecological movements. This event is part of the broader Global Degrowth Day that we celebrate today, the 4th of June of 2022. My name is Gabriela Cabaña, and I will be facilitating today's event. As an initial request, please remember to keep your microphones muted at all times, at least until the end of the conversation, in which we will be taking some questions. So what is the Global Degrowth Day? Emerging from the degrowth community, this day is an opportunity for all people, groups, organizations, and movements that feel connected to the idea of a good life for all to gather around the concept of degrowth. These local actions and events are meant to show alternative ways and ideas leading beyond a society that relies on economic growth. And around this effort, we want to make these ideas visible for as many people as possible. This Global Action Day helps to connect different existing initiatives to be part of a colorful and diverse movement for degrowth. And the focus, every year of celebration of the Global Degrowth Day has a focus. The focus of this year, the theme is on climate justice, and therefore the topic of our event today. But before that, maybe some of you are not necessarily familiar with degrowth. So as a way of an introduction, and before introducing our panelists today, I just wanted to give a brief working definition of degrowth. So degrowth is an idea that critiques the global capitalist system, which pursues growth at all costs, causing human exploitation and environmental destruction. The degrowth movements of activists and researchers advocates for societies that prioritize social and ecological well-being instead of corporate profits, overproduction, and excess consumption. This requires radical redistribution, reduction in the material size of the global economy, and a shift in common values towards care, solidarity, and autonomy. Degrowth means transforming societies to ensure environmental justice and a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And on what I'm reading, if you're interested to find out more, you can find more about both degrowth and the Global Degrowth Day in the website degrowth.info that you will also find in the chat. And you'll also find a map of the different activities that are taking place in different parts of the world today. So having said that, I'm going to give a brief outline of what we're going to do today. So we have 4 amazing panelists that are gonna first give us a round of presentations. They all participate in different movements. We're gonna hear them initially, and then we're gonna have a conversation, more of a cross questions and debate. So I'm going to introduce the people as they speak, but basically what you're going to hear, what we're asking each of our speakers is first to give us a brief history of the movement, an overview of the geographical presence of the movements in which they participate. And we also want to hear and learn about the movement's vision of system change and the key strategies and practices of interacting with and changing the system. Those are going to be the focus of these interventions. So we're going to start. I want to invite now to speak to Brototi Roy. Brototi is an ecological economist and political ecologist based jointly at the Central European University, Vienna, and the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, Barcelona, as a postdoctoral researcher. She is the co-president of Research on Degrowth, the Barcelona-based collective on action and research on degrowth, and a member of the support group for international degrowth conferences. And having introduced Brototi, now we're going to hear you for 7 minutes. I'm going to remind you when you have 1 minute left, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gabi. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. So are you able to see the screen? Yeah, okay. I'm really looking forward to all the conversations and all the discussions that we're going to have today. So what I will do in this initial 7-minute intervention is just to talk a little bit about degrowth and what has been going on in degrowth in terms of both academic spheres and activist spheres in the last 20 years, with a little bit more focus in the last 5 to 6 years where I have been more involved. And also to start talking a little bit also about how degrowth has been connecting with other movements, to give a couple of examples to then get the conversation rolling. So the first idea about what is degrowth. Now, Gabby gave a very good definition of what is degrowth. But since I first started discussing or talking or thinking about degrowth way back in 2014, 2015, while I was still in India, you would keep hearing about all these different definitions. No, it started as an activist slogan. So the history starts from 20 years ago in Lyon with this idea for car-free cities. That's where it started. It has been called often a radical political project for socio-ecological transformations. Some people have said it's too utopic. It's something that you would never reach. And this is one of the criticisms that we face for being too utopic and not on the ground. It has been called to be an umbrella term. So it talks about many things, but doesn't really go deep into one or the other aspect. And there are ways in which we defend this, no? For people from the degrowth movement. And because of it being an umbrella term, it has been called many times to be fragmented and confusing, no? There have been discussions of how degrowth is too radical and is talking more in the air. But more or less, people agree that it is very multidimensional. It questions this growth logic. It's anti-capitalist. And it is a way to prosperously look for well-being, considering that if we want to stay within the planetary boundaries, the way we are going, the way the lifestyles are going, is not proper. So it's a prosperous way down. In one sentence in this book, this line is taken from the first degrowth book, The Vocabulary, which was published in 2014, that it was born as a radical project, a proposal for radical change with an attempt to repoliticize the debate on socio-ecological justice and equity. To talk about it a little bit more pictorially, this is one of the photos which have been circulated many times, and it's a response to the questions that we've always been asked, especially when we talk about in global geography, especially when we talk about the global north and the global south. The degrowth is not about reducing GDP. It is about moving away from using economic growth as the only way of measuring well-being. So what people envision in a degrowth society is that it's going to be different. It's not going to be the less of same, but it's going to be envisioning something which is much different activities, different forms and uses of energy, different relations, different gender roles, different ways in which we relate to the human and the non-human world. Now, since it was started two decades ago, there have been a gradual increase in both activism and literature around degrowth. And this diagram is taken from this article by Weiss and Cataneo in 2017, published in Ecological Economics, which basically did a stock of degrowth emerging as an academic discipline between 2006 and 2015. And they did a review of 91 articles, did a review of the 6 different academic conferences, which you can see here, the dates and where each of the conferences were held, and 7 different academic special issues in journals. And you can see what were the ways in which degrowth has been in conversation with multiple other movements, with multiple other ways of imagining socio-ecological justice, and how since then it has continued to, let's say, develop and continue to have interactions and collaborations with other movements and other disciplines and other people. But at the same time, this was one of the questions, no? Like, what is the geographical extent of the degrowth movement or the degrowth subdiscipline? It has largely been a European project. So you can see the maximum number of papers. So this article was taking only stock of the academic literature, has been published in Spain, followed by France, UK, US, and Germany. You don't see a lot of representation from the majority of the world. So these are certain questions that I hope we can discuss more during the discussion. At the same time, there have been multiple conferences, events, workshops, discussions, talks, not just the international conferences, but also other forms of having conversations, not just with academics, but also with activists, also with the EU policymakers. You can see the post-growth 2018 conference in Brussels, which was conversations with members of the European Parliament. And this was all before COVID. In the last couple of years, we have had a decrease for obvious reasons in more interactions, in more discussions, in more ways of finding commonalities with other movements, which in today's discussion and in the further discussions that I will be mentioning soon, we hope to change. So during the pandemic, we had a couple of online or hybrid conferences. But now again, we are having more and more discussions, and this is an invitation for more people to join Degrowth. There is going to be a conference next year in Zagreb. In September, there is going to be another event in Vienna, and there's going to be the first ever Degrowth festival in the beginning of fall. So you can see in one way there is a growth as an academic paradigm. In another way, there is this more and more interaction with other movements, and this is the interaction between climate justice movements and degrowth. There have always been a strong link between the climate camps of Ende Gelände in Germany and degrowth workshops, degrowth summer schools. And just to say, this is not new. This has been going on for a long time. This was the first summer school that I attended way back in 2016, which had a strong conversation between degrowth and environmental justice. There have always been movements in the climate camps. So before a Blockadia action, there would be a summer school talking about degrowth. So these alliances or these conversations have been taking place. Because of this, there have been in the recent years a rise in more and more written forms of engaging with different other movements. These are a couple of the books which have been published in the recent past. And I think Gabby will talk about this more, but this month we have another book coming up, Degrowth and Strategy, which comes from the Vienna conference and talks about also how to think of socio-ecological transformations while linking with other movements. And that's it. That's like a little bit of history of degrowth and where it comes from. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brototi, for that overview, very helpful, and thank you for sticking with the time. I know it's very brief, but we have a lot of ground to cover, so thanks for doing that. So we're going to move to our next speaker. His name is Paul Harnett. Paul is an economist with extensive international experience, specializing in public finance, climate change, environment, and cash transfers. He sits on the UK political circle of XR as a representative of the North of England, and is an experienced talks and training person of XR North. And he's also the co-founder and director of World Basic Income, which I think is something that's going to be in his intervention today. So Paul, the floor is yours. We hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, first of all, apologies. Between this morning and this afternoon, my video seems to have stopped working. So first of all, an apology for that. Let me get my slide up. I hope you can see that. My name's Paul Harnett. I'm from Extinction Rebellion and also a campaign called World Basic Income, which Gabby is familiar with from our time in India together at the Basic Income Conference. I was asked originally to speak on behalf of Extinction Rebellion. So let me do that in the first slide. Most of you will have heard of Extinction Rebellion. We're an international organization started in 2018.
Paul, sorry for interrupting you, but we can only see the general slide. We don't see the actual presentation. So we're still in the first.
The first one?
I mean, we see, we don't see the presentation vision. We just see the PowerPoint as it's in open. So I think you have to change the view so we can see the actual presentation. So we're all seeing the same, right? It's just you can see the
yes, maybe you can make it full screen.
It is full screen.
Maybe you can do start slide, because we just see the first slide now. Start slideshow, maybe.
Oh, I've done that.
I think you can, if when you're sharing, if you can choose.
Yeah, now it go.
Is that full slide now?
No, because I think you have to reshare your screen because you decided to share only this screen and the presentation is not being shared. Is it like in a different window? It's a very annoying thing Zoom does. But I think it's possible if you go to the sharing option, you can like stop sharing and share again the presentation, and then we can see what you see.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Stop sharing. Share again.
And then you can decide on the.
Yeah.
Yes, now it's good. Okay, go. Yes, now it's great.
Okay, let's see if it changes when it should. Yeah, so Extinction Rebellion, very well known. There are no leaders. That's a really important issue. It's a self-organizing system. And it simply has three demands. The first is tell the truth, which is directed mostly at the media, but also at corporations, etc. And ourselves. Act now, which is essentially let's stop using fossil fuels and let's have a plan for it. And the third demand is to be the change. Let's have a different type of democracy. Let's have citizens' assemblies, for example, and other types of deliberative democracy. And that third demand is really important because what it means is that XR does not present solutions. So whilst a lot of people who would say that they were from Extinction Rebellion would be interested in degrowth, Extinction Rebellion itself does not have a policy on degrowth. It will invite speakers, everyone will listen, but ultimately any policies should be decided by citizens' assemblies. Some people say that's a weak point of Extinction Rebellion, and it's certainly the case that this year, because the crisis is so bad at the moment, they did come up in the UK with an intermediate demand, and that said no more fossil fuel licenses and a stop to all subsidies. So they were being solutionist for the first time. And as you would expect, similarly with the degrowth movement, a common critique is XR wants to take us all back to the Stone Age. We've heard that quite a few times. So yeah, basically XR avoids solutions, but degrowth is implicit. And many people who support degrowth, Jason Hickel is the prime example in the UK, would be the supporter, I would say, of XR in general. So XR really doesn't have a lot to say about degrowth. And that's why I said that I would also talk about World Basic Income, because I'm also a co-founder of World Basic Income. Now I have to, oh, here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So World Basic Income was established in 2015 in Manchester, UK, and it's basically a campaign to give every single person in the world, and that includes children, a basic income as a human right. And we have international board members, we have an international advisory board, and we have international academic advisors as well. And we are about to implement a basic income in Malawi in partnership with Impact Market, not to everybody in Malawi, but to a few hundred people, which is exciting for us. Come on. It seems that my computer has suddenly got a problem. Oh, here we are. So what is World Basic Income saying? It's basically saying that what we need is a global people's fund. And ultimately, it would be controlled by a global citizens' assembly. Where would the money come from? Charges for the use of the global commons would be all contributions to the fund. What would the fund do? It would invest in transition industries like renewables and insulation, etc. And then the dividends of that fund would be paid out to the people of the world as a basic income. And children would receive an equal amount. Many basic income experiments pay less money to children. We say no, everyone gets it as a human right. And this is not pie in the sky. It would take elements of the Alaskan and Norwegian oil funds as its basis. The Alaskan fund pays out usually about $2,000 a year to every person in Alaska, well, every adult. And the Norwegian oil fund is now the biggest fund in the world. It's got over $1 trillion in it, because most of the revenues of Norwegian oil have been saved in the pension fund there. This fund would be particularly appropriate for carbon extraction, fossil fuel extraction. And what we recommend is that fossil fuel extraction should be capped, and that cap should be set by scientists. And for the few licenses sold, if any, the proceeds would go to the fund. We're at the stage now, there's very little political will for this, but if there was, it would be very easy to implement. Why? Because 100 companies internationally account for 72% of fossil fuel extraction. So if the political will existed, it would be very easy to implement. I said before, we would use the global commons, charge on the global commons. So that the three obvious ones there are air, land and sea. And for each of those, you would charge for the pollution and also the use of air, land and sea. And there's some examples there. Land value tax would be a charge on land. Royalties for the use of the sea, for fishing, etc. But I can give you other examples of global commons. Digital data. The top 4 or 5 companies in the world are basically those that control our data. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. And really, there should be fees on that data. We've co-created that data. Another commons is money itself. So if there were financial transactions, you could actually tax them. The Tobin tax. Tobin actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on this, but it's never really been implemented properly.
Paul, sorry, we are in the time.
Okay, 1 minute.
No, that was a minute ago. I don't know if you heard the notice, but okay, give you 1 more minute to wrap up, please.
Okay, so I could go on intellectual property, inheritance, wealth, but degrowth would be natural as a result of the cap on CO2 extraction. But the thing that I'd finally like to emphasize is that the key here is that this fund would grow each year so that all future generations could benefit from it. And that's really important. So you don't pay everything out that comes into the fund, you keep it for future generations and only pay out on your dividends. I'll stop there. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Paul. I guess we can leave if you had something left to the discussion. So don't worry, we'll still have time for that. Thank you for that. And now we move to our next speaker. Her name is Shrishtee Bajpai. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. So Shrishtee is a researcher activist from India and a member of Kalpavriksh Environment Action Group, where she works on themes of environmental and social justice, radical alternatives, radical democracy, more than human governance, and rights of nature. She helps in coordinating the Vikalp Sangam process, alternative conferences, in India, and it's a core team member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. If you don't know that initiative, you can Google it right now. She presently serves on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and is a fellow at the Post-Growth Institute in the United States. So Shrishtee, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabriela. Just let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So you don't have to Google about Global Tapestry. I will speak about it right now. So the Global Tapestry of Alternatives is a process which I'll speak more about, but primarily trying to build confluences of resistance and alternatives across the world. And I'll explain what do we mean by that in creating, sharing, exchanges, and collaboration among various alternatives networks and movements, being supportive of active advocacy and solidarity, and very importantly, collective envisioning. I won't go into much of a detail of what do we mean, but rather speak about how this process is intending to do some of this. But importantly, to speak about what do we mean by transformative and systemic alternatives, it is important for us to, in these times when actually much of our alternatives are either getting co-opted or greenwash or in many ways articulated in different ways, it is important for us to say that we're looking for alternatives which challenge the structural roots of unsustainability and inequality. And that would mean concentration of power in hands of the corporates, of the nation state, capitalism, state-dominated regimes, patriarchy, any form of discrimination based on caste, race, ethnicity, and of course, domination of humans over rest of nature. And so alternatives are in some ways divided in two, of course, very closely related with each other. One is resistance. So we know a lot of communities are responding and resisting against these various forms of domination through different resistance movements. One, this being the picture that you see on the screen is from 30 years ago, where a community, an Adivasi community in central India was demanding to stop a hydroelectric project in their territories, and in that way articulating their own vision and their own cosmovisions of connections with the river, which they were trying to protect. So in many of these resistance movements, what essentially one means is that those different visions and ways of being and worldviews are already defined and articulated. The other is, of course, constructive alternatives, people, what they're creating on the ground, people, what they're trying to do and come up with those visions. And degrowth being one of them, coming from the heart of the capitalist societies, of how do we, and Brototi very wonderfully has already explained what degrowth movement is. But these are many different ways of articulating life and different ways of how social organization could be, social, ecological, political organization could be. And many of these examples are already emerging across the world. And so what Global Tapestry for Alternatives is trying to do is to weave together many of these alternative processes that are giving us visions for the future. Some of the activities, just to give you a brief sense of how we are trying to do is to create dialogue on alternatives. So how do we talk to each other? How do we understand ourselves and our movements better? And that is what one intention of the process is. There's a compilation also of various resilience stories, various stories of alternatives, which I also wanted to speak about, but maybe we'll do that later, of various powerful stories of people, which I think sometimes we lose in many of these discussions of people's stories and how they're transforming the world. And also through that, and these were the stories that I think were very powerful also at the time when we were going through the COVID crisis, or maybe in many ways still, that had very important lessons to offer of how do we move towards a different world, a world that is more just, equitable, and resilient. So we organized these dialogue series of powerful stories from the ground, speaking to each other and speaking about their struggles and processes. And this compilation has some 20 stories from across the world where people responded to the crisis in a much better way because they had their alternative transformation process already undertaken, but also gave us important lessons and stories to look forward to. What Global Tapestry of Alternatives is trying to see in transformation, if we see life in some vague way, in some not in our silos, but interconnected ways of working and being together. Many of these examples and stories that are part of the movement are talking about these 5 spheres, which are interconnected, interrelated, and which show that life cannot be actually working in silos, and how when we work towards more transformative processes, things come together and they're not really contradicting each other. We need to get a little bit more into detail of what it would mean. But essentially for our movements, it is important to think about the values that ground many of these together, because a lot of our contexts are different, a lot of our realities are different, and so it might not be possible for degrowth movement to actually make sense in a country like India probably, but there's some commonalities, there's certain values that degrowth movement talks about and some movements in India are speaking about, and that is really what brings us together, and that is what as GTA we believe is the strength of many of the transformative processes that we are speaking about. And hence it is trying to create those spaces of collaborations where we learn from each other, give visibility to many of these processes that a lot of us don't know about, and also to inspire other people to actually create these processes. And a usual question that a lot of times is asked is, how do we create a macro change? So in many ways to also begin talking about how do we create those networks, convergences, where we begin speaking of macro change as well. And importantly, dreaming, because a lot of us have lost that sense of dreaming. So how do we collectively envision dreams for the future world? Gabrielle will finish in a minute. And so the structure right now of GTA is that it is a process. We don't want it to become an organization. There's no central control mechanism, something what Paul was also mentioning about XR. We want to have a decentralized weaving of movements, that wherever movements exist, they actually collaborate and work together. We just facilitate in some ways in some processes. Currently, a core team is holding the process, but mostly it's volunteer based. And then there are endorsing networks and organizations from across the world that provide us credibility. It is essentially built on 3 important processes, regional processes. One that I'm part of, Vikalp Sangam, Alternative Consequences in India. The other 2 are Crianza Mutua in Mexico and Colombia. These 3 processes are doing what GTA is doing at an international level, but at regional level, that's what they're doing. What GTA also began was a global processes of different meta processes that have emerged over the last 2 or 3 years, talking about systemic change. How do we actually begin to talk about these? What do we mean by systems change? What do we mean by transformations actually collectively? The other attempt is to do meta mapping of alternatives, which is an overview, get a sense of what is the global spread of alternatives, get a geographic and thematics map, which actually is used by the people themselves and the networks themselves. And what it really wants to talk about, or what it really wants to stress, that there are multiple ways of imagining, there are pluriversal ways of imagining and living with the world. And so how do we enhance that sense of vision and that sense of transformative change? So this is a website which you can visit and know more about. And of course, we can talk more in case I was too fast, because sometimes that what does colonial education does to you. But over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Shrishtee. Thank you so much for that overview. And now I give the floor to our final speaker. That's Emanuele Genovese. Emanuele studies statistics at Sapienza in Rome. He's part of Fridays for Future Italy and is the referent of the Rome group. I give the floor to you, Emanuele, so you can give us our last intervention of today, and then we can go to more of a conversation. So the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me. We are present as international movements in I think all the continents, but in Europe and in the North countries, the most. I would say that the movement began as an emergent phenomenon. It was driven by an urgency and fostered by many factors. Being born this way, it always been and within very different positions, and therefore different theories of change. The interesting thing I think, is that over time, no idea of the world has disappeared. Later, a mosaic of derivative practices has been composed, many of which have yet to be full tests. That it is, the march have been joined by civil disobedience actions, as Extinction Rebellion, contaminations within with other movements, attempts to find visibility in the media system, etc., etc. Maybe, as Woody Allen said, as long as it works. I think it is interesting because it is similar to the model we would like to apply to the system, always adding subjects, never taking away, adding intermediations, spaces to be presided over with our bodies. So enriching democracies to transform it. Perhaps there are similarities with the concept of no-reformist reforms in this. Then there have been major shifts over these years, perhaps thanks to the internationalisms that have been a winning feature for our movement, and that have brought attention to the importance of giving MAPA people a voice, of re-engaging on some issues, for example, the labor issues. In Italy, we have the example of the experience with the GKPN, that is a worker collective. And also, this also permits to us to look to a different generational target, no? Not only the youngest, and of thinking on policies in a feminist or also in a degrowth sense. We have not always been able to express all of this at best, sometimes because of a lack of our ability, sometimes because of the mediatic system, but we have done a lot of different campaigns. I think that we talk about this later, but during pandemics, we have done a manifesto. We call it Back to the Future. And in the years, in the different countries, we have done a lot of campaigns. The most recent, I think, is the more recent, I think, is about EU taxonomy. And then there are, there are also campaigns that have the growth base as positive money or grounded or stay grounded. Yeah, I think it is.
Yes, you want to leave it there, Emanuele, for now?
Yeah.
Great. Good. So we can continue making a bit more conversational. Wait, I'm going to remove you from the spotlight. Great, thank you so much. Let me go back to gallery view so I can see everyone. So before we open the floor to more questions from the audience as well, we wanted to have some space so you can react to each other. So what you heard, you probably had heard about each other's initiatives before. So this is maybe a space so we can reflect on how these different initiatives and collectives and movements and struggles connect, or maybe also have differences. I think both things are can be very productive to have in mind. So I'm gonna leave it for you. Like if you want to talk, maybe you can raise your hand and I can try to direct so we don't all speak at the same time. But maybe since Brototi was the first one in speaking and she hinted at some questions, I wanted to ask maybe Brototi to start this conversation by saying how Degrowth interacts and has been dialoguing for a long time now already with different movements, among them some of which we have heard today, and also how this takes a question that is usually asked about degrowth, which is, what about the Global South? Like how much of this approach, and also considering you yourself being from the Global South, how you make sense of this approach in your own context and in a context of transnational solidarity. So yeah, and then Emanuele, Shrishtee, and Paul, whoever wants to talk, just can raise their hand. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm always so inspired by all these conversations because we see everyone in our own capacities are doing so many things, which talk to each other, but somehow we need to maybe find more common grounds to have a conversation, no? So when I was listening to Shrishtee, I noted down something, because we've always had this question of what about the global south, no? We talk about this in degrowth, but we also talk about this in other kinds of movements which talk about transnational solidarity. So what we're trying to do, or what we have always tried to do with degrowth, is to break this colonial imperial domination of the North over the South, no? Like within the degrowth movement. And we have not been very successful about that, because as I showed the diagram of like how it emerges as an academic discipline, you have all the writings coming from the global North. And there are many systemic reasons for why that happens. Who has, for example, when you're fighting a movement, when you're trying to stop your land and livelihood from being destroyed, you don't have time to sit and go through a peer review process to publish. I mean, these are very obvious things that we need to talk about when we're talking about extending solidarity, is that who are the people sitting on the table and what are the positionalities and backgrounds that they come from. So I think one of the ways in which the degrowth movement can have proper discussions with, or form proper alliances with other movements, is to know never to speak on behalf of any other movement, never to, and this is what when Shrishtee was saying, no, but maybe degrowth in India doesn't make sense. When I started the Degrowth India initiative, we were all in university in Delhi, and we were looking at the imperialist mode of living in Delhi in our context as master students. This doesn't translate to different other realities even within the country, no? So it's very, very important that we look at these pluriverse of ideas that are there, and to see if there can be a dialogue, not to go and tell that what you're doing sounds exactly like degrowth, so you should be a degrowth movement. No, never to do this, and being very aware that when and how is that a problem, and when and how, what are the ways in which true allyship or true solidarities can be built. But at the same time, I see a lot of commonalities, but I think this process of forming alliances and this process of building solidarities is a slow and caring, careful process. And this is something we should always acknowledge. I think I'll stop with that there.
Thank you, Brototi. Really insightful reflection on that. And yes, I agree that this idea, this challenge that we all see of creating international solidarity, I think it's present in all the struggles we have heard from today. You know, the global tapestry of alternative is also very wide. Well, Fridays for Future is an excellent example of something that has emerged in different ways in different places of the world. And I wanted maybe to go back with this, if there are no interventions from your side, maybe to Paul, because basic income is also a proposal that has been taking more of this international, not just asking locally for basic income, but also as a goal of global solidarity. Like how do you see that, Paul? How do you see this concern for justice maybe talks with other things that you heard from the other speakers?
Yeah, it's basic income's quite an interesting idea depending on where you talk about it. So in much of the global north, basic income is viewed as an alternative to welfare. And virtually all of the proposals for a basic income are indeed that. It basically says, let's take how much we're spending on welfare, divide it up amongst the people. There you are, everybody gets a basic income. Just make sure that, a few people don't lose out. So you would retain housing benefit, you would retain disability benefit, etc. But our approach is completely different to that. Not mutually exclusive either. We're not saying don't do that with the welfare systems in the north. But what we're saying is that, I suppose, in a nutshell, we're saying that our resources, our common resources, have basically been stolen from the people of the world. And there should be mechanisms for the charges on those resources to be given back to them. I mean, part of my presentation mentioned land value tax. Well, that's a halfway house as far as I'm concerned. I mean, personally, I don't think that anyone should own any land. It makes as much sense as owning the sea and the air. But whilst people are owning large amounts of land, they should be actually paying a tax for it. That was the original tax. Income tax has only existed for about 100 years. So yeah, the idea of it being a world community and the whole world benefiting from the fruits of the world, I think has only really emerged recently. And it was quite a struggle for us to be accepted by even the basic income movement. But I think more and more we are being accepted, and a lot of what we say might make sense, but the journey to get there is going to be a difficult one and will require a huge amount of international solidarity. Yeah. And I think XR recognises that as well. I mean, there was an action last year against Amazon, and that was an international action. It was taken in quite a few countries, and I think we're recognising that if you are going to attack power at its source, you really have to do it in many different countries all at the same time if you can. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. And maybe I wanted to ask, if I can take the advantage of being facilitating, I wanted to ask Shrishtee about something that I really like how you said, like it drew my attention from your presentation, that when you talked about how the global tapestry of alternatives the structure is a process, not an organization. I found that really interesting. And you know, we have always constantly, I think all the movements present here, we deal with this idea of like how to organize without losing this sense of being an horizontal, you know, decentralized network of people that, you know, has like not really like a top-down control, right? So I just wanted to ask if you could maybe expand on that, like because this has been, you know, you have quite a lot of experience, and what have been your learnings, and how do you think that maybe other movements that are here could like learn from that? What have been your main insights in trying to stay in this, as you said, structure as a process?
Well, thanks. The experience actually is from the Indian processes of alternative confluences, Vikalp Sangam, where the intention has been to build it as a process rather than an organization, which is where I'm more rooted in. But similarly, also in Crianza Mutuas, Mexico and Colombia, they have intended it to be a process. So emerging from these regional processes, which have been going on for say 7, 8, 9 years, that this intention came also seeding the GTA process, where we focus it on as a process, not as an organization, which is very clear in terms of experiences of how organizations and networks get into the same cobweb of institutionalization, where they don't know how to get out of it, and then there are issues and bureaucracy being replicated exactly the same what we critique in the systems, so-called outside systems or the capitalist systems. And hence it was important that we don't become an organization, because it then creates certain obligations and it creates certain systems which become repressive for its own members, and see it as a long drawn process that takes its own shapes, which is not predetermined by a group of people such as me or others in any way, but rather it has a life of its own. It is determined by whosoever comes and joins the process. And in that way, sometimes process will see a low phase also. It might not be thriving all the time. The way we imagine organizations always have to continuously prove their existence to be of worth or value. But a process is a process. So sometimes it goes through a low phase, sometimes it is very vibrant and thriving. So we are open to surprises, we are open to challenges, we are open to situations, both good and bad. And I think that has been some of the deliberations of not making an organization, and also as members not getting burnt out with the whole organization and management of it, but rather taking it slowly. And as Brototi was saying, that a solidarity sort of a network where you have to be for the people, by the people, in a kind of that sort of a system. It has to go slow, it can't be fast, it can't be proving itself all the time. And so that's why I think in some ways we have kept it as a process. And the learnings from that is very, very challenging, because we always go through situations, very tough situations, of who speaks on behalf of GTA. So while I'm here and I'm speaking about GTA, so what gives me the credibility to speak about it? And it's an unresolvable issue in many ways, because there are also 30, 40, 45 international endorsing networks and organizations. So do I take every decision through them? And all of these very practical but important challenges are there. And somehow we are navigating through it, not perfectly in any way. But I think that has been a very important process for learning for us. And that led to the emergence of what we have as a GT assembly, a representative assembly group from all the endorsing network and organization. So slowly and steadily coming up with the processes, with making mistakes and with also learning from them. But it has been quite inspiring and insightful process in that way for many of the general situations and problems of networks. Yeah, thanks, Gabriela.
No, thank you. That's super insightful. I think this challenge of embracing uncertainty and embracing these ambiguities and, these open-ended questions that are not, they shouldn't be seen as a failure, but actually like we should embrace them and acknowledge them and keep them open. I think that sounds like a very healthy way of approaching things. At least I think many collectives could learn from that. Thank you for that insight. And maybe I have one more question I would like to ask Emanuele, so maybe he can expand a bit more on how you think that Fridays for Future can engage or not with degrowth. And especially because when we see pushing for climate action, there is a lot of belief in growth, growth as part of the solution. It's part of this wider idea of progress, of development, and in particular, this faith in science and technology, as we're going to just push our way through this with growth and with technology. So how do you see that in your context, and how do you face that as a movement? How much do you engage with those tensions, and how do you see maybe degrowth could offer a helpful outlook for you as well?
Okay, so in the West, we are most of the people aren't conscious of our historical responsibilities. This is the first thing now we have to widely spread. So if we accept our historical responsibilities, then there are some policies that are both the growth policies and our policies that are structured and are written by and proposed by the south of the world, or we prefer call MAPA, most affected people and areas. And for example, during COP26 and G20, we have tried to give people a voice and to talk about debt rescheduling or cancellation, grant only financing for adaptation, the damage of carbon credits markets, and so on. And we also quote some economists, heterodox economists, as Nongosilla. I was searching the quote, and he wrote an open letter some months ago, and he said, for example, that post-colonial socioeconomic dislocation exacerbated by market liberalization have forced African countries into a vicious cycle involving several structural deficiencies, as a lack of food and energy sovereignty, low value-added manufacturing and extractive industries, and then he had that this situation is imposed by the IMF and international creditors, usually focused on 5 problematic strategies: export-oriented growth, a lack of liberalization of foreign direct investment, over-promotion of tourism, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and liberalization of financial markets. Now, all these issues are, I think, guided now by the north of the world. So, if we don't act on these policies, so we can't construct the growth policies for all. It's difficult, but we are trying to facing with these issues.
Thank you, Emanuele. Yes, like precisely these like larger issues of power. No, that's what we need to address. I think that's something shared here. Like also what Paul said about some things that could be done, but it's all about political will, and then how we contest and try to reclaim that power to put it to a different end. So thank you so much for that. I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment. So if there are no more reactions, oh, Paul, yes. And after Paul, I want to invite the rest of the people present now in the room. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand and ask yourself, or you can write it in the chat, however you prefer. So we can start also receiving comments from you. But Paul, yes, please. And then.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what Shrishtee was saying. And I know that they're working a lot with indigenous peoples. And I'd just like, from my point of view, a lot of the ideas that come from indigenous peoples seem to resonate a lot more. They understand respect for the planet and probably would react quite well to degrowth. So I'd just like her to expand on that maybe a little bit if she could.
Do you want to do that, Shrishtee, before we go to the floor?
Expand on what exactly?
Are you finding in your interactions with indigenous peoples that their approach to the solutions are more akin to degrowth and respect for the especially the land, but also the air and the sea a lot more than other groups that you interact with?
Well, yeah, I mean, difficult to answer because the indigenous peoples here in India are too diverse in many ways, and also maybe have many diverse ideas in ways they perceive the world. So in any way, I can't articulate adequately at all of what would be a unified idea. But in my interaction with one indigenous community, Adivasi community in central India, and that's where my understanding of how they perceive transformative change comes from. And that, I think, in many ways is also, I don't think so people would articulate, and that's why I was saying that the many visions of transformative change are quite diverse for people, even within their communities, while we navigate those spaces. And in that way, whole degrowth, and that's why I was making that comment earlier, that something like degrowth might not be applicable or acceptable or understandable also to many communities and peoples we work with, is because the idea comes from the societies, or idea is in the societies where the communities have actually grown considerably beyond limits. And so one begins talking about how do you degrow. But for many communities that reality doesn't exist. And so relating to something like to degrow is is, to my mind, also unimaginable, but not to say my own consumptive lifestyles. And I think that is why it is important for movements such as Degrowth and others to also talk about visions that are emerging from the ground, or different visions of how people are imagining economies, or how people are thinking about its interconnections with, say, politics, ecological movements, social movements. So for example, something like, say, Swaraj, the idea of economy that's very ancient in terms of word also, but also that was popularized in recent times, which is basically during the independence movement by Gandhi, but later also by J.C. Kumarappa here in India, speaking of the ideas of philosophy of work, philosophy of economy of enoughness, and all of those ideas way as in 100 years ago, 85 years ago. And so those ideas are never really spoken in spaces like these or other such, and always assumed that as if from the global south, many of such ideas have never come about, but people have been speaking about these when it was emerging. And so how do we make these spaces also inclusive of those ideas, those worldviews, and those philosophies, and which is still from a certain thinking class in the communities, but it could be so many other diverse ways, maybe not even articulated in any term or such thing. So anyway, I don't think so, Paul, I'm answering your question in any very clear way. I think I'm thinking through while I'm also answering to it. But essentially, main point is that it is too diverse to be able to put in or explained in one way, and it's not narrowed down to a theory or to an idea as well. So the more we get into understanding people's processes, the more we understand the complexities of it, but there lies their own worldviews. I think for us people from outside, it gets easier if somebody says Buen Vivir, so then we can understand, okay, there's a term that describes everything, but it is a lot more complex in the communities. I don't know how far I've answered your question, but somehow I tried.
Thank you, Shrishtee. That's very insightful. Now I see Somaye has a question. Can we listen to you? Yes, you can unmute yourself. We can't hear you. You're muted. No, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I am Somaye Samimi. I'm from Iran. I'm PhD student in environmental science, and that's the webinar was very useful for me. I'm working on degrowth especially in global south. My idea is to implement or apply the degrowth idea in local scales. I just want to share my experience. My country is an arid area. The main problem is the scarcity of water. We do not have enough water, and we have too much agriculture. The idea of degrowth here is not degrowth of economy. It is most of the time is the growth of policy, the growth of politics, the growth of power. For example, we just have wheat problem. Wheat, many lands are in agriculture sector belongs to wheat, because wheat is a strategic product, and every country wants to be independent, self-independent on wheat and on food, and food safety is important for them. But when we want to apply the degrowth, and we say that, okay, we should limit our wheat production, the answer is that then we have to import it. And when we want to start to import that, something like Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war, it just affects. Maybe in great organizations, a multinational cooperation, the problem and is economy. But in local scale and in regional scale, the policy and the power has a very main way in applying this. Sometimes it seems necessary. It is the end. We should go for degrowth. But how? and in which scale and who should pay is important. For example, agriculture owners, farmers, they are not that much rich. Wheat is not that much, expensive, but it is the only thing that they have. When we want to force them not to just continue growing wheat, it is their life. Then what can we do? The challenge here is more complicated than the idea of degrowth. Thank you.
Thank you, Somaya. I know it was a comment and not really a question, but I see Brototi raising her hand, and maybe you can also address some of the issues that she raised in her question.
Well, I was raising the hand from before, but maybe I can say something to the experience that you shared, Somaya. No, I was thinking of, well, okay, I have 2 points to make from the first 2 questions, and I will make it very quickly. The first one, when Paul and Emanuele were talking about international or global solidarities, and I was trying to think together of what are the ways in which we can do that and provide support to each other. So Paul mentioned the act against Amazon, no? So, and I was also thinking, when we look at a lot of these fossil fuel projects, a lot of the headquarters of a lot of the multinational companies are based either in different European cities or in the US. So one way in which there has been a transnational solidarity has been to go to these shareholder meetings of these companies which are doing massive harmful extractions in different parts of the global south, and to kind of channelize those energies together. So I was trying to see if we could talk about those things and trying to find strategies together. And with the point from Shrishtee, this was something which we have debated a lot. And I would agree with what you say. And I think this is one of our challenges when we try to decolonize degrowth, is that degrowth as an idea, if you break it down to what the idea stands for, does not come from Europe. And I will give you one example from Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote way back in the early 1920s about how when you're trying to deal with the problems of poverty, you have to go much deeper and try to look at it from not just the efforts of production, but also what it does to material use and also what it does to human relations. And although degrowth in its literature always says, no, these are the forefathers, these are the how do you call it, the visionaries from whom we have drawn the idea, it is never very explicitly mentioned that these ideas have been there in different parts of the global south. I know from my context, but maybe Shrishtee also, maybe that's what she was saying, if I didn't get it wrong, that you don't need to have those technical academic terms, but when you talk to people on the ground, you know that there is a lot of knowledge which is not translated into academic knowledge, but it's knowledge, and it's very valid knowledge. But we somehow, since we still operate in these spaces of academia and these ivory towers, we kind of don't acknowledge that. And I think the only way in which degrowth can be valid in India or anywhere else in the global south is to acknowledge where exactly are these ideas coming from, that it did not start 2 decades ago. These have been there for a long time, and just because they were not written down in French or in Spanish, it doesn't mean that these ideas have not been there. So I think that is a key point if we want to move for not just decolonization of the imaginary, which has been this key phase for degrowth, but actual decolonization of what exactly do we mean by degrowth. And in this sense, coming to your example of maybe I'm not the best person to talk about this, but I was thinking about the different alternatives, about the confluences, and I had read the work of all the different alternatives in the Vikalp Sangam process, and some of them are how people have taken back power in their own communities, the community forest rights, and maybe to think of that as a way in which farmers, collectives can come together, more autonomy, more democracy, which is what degrowth talks about, and which is also what Shrishtee mentioned in all the different points that she said about what are the different kinds of how do we envision transformation. That's it. Sorry for taking so much time, but yeah.
No worries. Thanks, Brototi. I don't know if there are any more questions or any other comments from our panelists, or yes, we still have time for one more round. So if you were feeling shy, maybe now you want to say something. I see a thumb up, or was that a request to speak, Sarjit, or yes? Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead. And then we go with Paul, but go ahead, Sarjit.
Sure. So yeah, I have a podcast which started when I visited a Degrowth conference, and just to kind of lift the voices that were coming out of there, and was my first experience with Degrowth as well. So, and I've been sort of jumping in and out of different circles within sort of that are around sort of that subject, and I find I have a few. I'm going to read what I wrote. I'm not sure if I'm making a specific point here, but when, for example, Brototi talked about, true solidarities, and it's a slow process, and we shouldn't sort of co-opt others and who do similar work. But then I'm also thinking, like, why not? Because I mean, how do you otherwise expedite the process of solidarity? Right? And you see Extinction Rebellion and how they're very noticeable now, right? Over the past few years, and they've kind of, and when you talk about degrowth, even if I mention it to some of my friends, they wouldn't know what it is, but they know Extinction Rebellion. And I'm not someone who is trying to do like provocative, sort of activism, but I'm just trying to toy with the idea, what if there is something between that? So, and again, there's no like absolute that I have, but going back to, again, Brototi's point where I disagreed, where I think does it matter when she talks about what was it, whether we should whether the idea of degrowth is actually coming out of and historically coming out of India or whatever, like, does it matter? Is like, would it matter where the next cancer, sort of medicine came out in the world? Like, so it's as long as it's kind of applicable globally, as long as it works, and I dare to say this, like, someone had mentioned something about Gandhi, and I said, well, does it matter that Gandhi said it? Because I mean, as long as it makes sense, it doesn't matter who says it, because everyone invariably says something on a day-to-day basis that is that makes sense, so it doesn't matter who says it or where it came out of. So I think as long as we can kind of import and export these ideas without linking them to historical context, but just more like current application of it. So sorry, I think I've made a mishmash of whatever I was trying to say, but I'm just trying to say it as it comes. So yeah, it's lovely listening to you all. I just, my mind goes a lot of places and I try to gather them, and I'm always lost within these kind of dialogues, but it's interesting. It's always generative, and thank you for doing these dialogues. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarjit. I see Paul has his hand raised, but I don't know if someone else wants to maybe react to this comment before I go to him, because I suspect that might be, yes, Shrishtee? Is that, okay. And then Brototi, go.
Yeah, I resonate partly with what Sarvajit was saying, but and so with that resonance in mind, my only caution is that why it is important to say, especially about these different contexts, and what Brototi was mentioning and was also hinting at, that there are ideas also at the global south, because we don't live in an equal world. We live in an unequal world where certain ideas get more pronounced, certain ideas are more spoken about, just because they're coming from a particular geographies. So we are not living in an equal world where all ideas are same. People have been articulating these cosmovisions for all their lives, and that is what I was maybe not properly or articulately, but trying to say that indigenous peoples have been, and many other local communities have been living their lives in a very degrowth way, but they're not articulating it as degrowth, and so somehow this idea has become as if that is how people are supposed to live now. But people have been living like this for many decades, and there has been an assault on them and dispossessing them from their lands and their territories, and actually making them live in different conditions. And that's what they're resisting at. So what one is trying to articulate is that these ideas are already existing, not articulated in just the same language that all of us know. Yes, there's resonance. Yes, there are commonalities, and that's what our strength is, and that is what we should work on, and that's what our movement building should focus towards. But let's not say that this is an idea that has just emerged in last 2 decades by these people, and it's a novel idea, never thought about. I think that is what people from the global south or in other places are actually challenging, that there is a lot of movements who have already possibly done that or spoken about it, and let's acknowledge that, and yeah, use it wherever we want, but let people use it. Let's not impose these terms on people who don't want it to be imposed or don't understand it. So yeah, that's what possibly I was trying to say, and I must stress on that as well.
Thank you, Shrishtee. Brototi?
So this would be mainly to answer to the questions that Sarjeet asked, and I wanted to give an example of the climate march which happened in London in 2015, where there was this collective of brown, black, and indigenous communities called Wretched of the Earth, who were co-organizing the march with other groups from UK and elsewhere. And at some point, right like a few minutes or a few hours before the march was supposed to happen, the organizers told them that no, your banners are too provocative and they are not too friendly with people. And I'm going to find the link of the blog and send it right after I finish talking. Because what they were saying was that the climate catastrophe has been brought about by 500 years of colonialism, and this is not something new. And what the other organizers wanted was like, no, we need to be friendly and we need to get more people on board. So what in the end they wanted to have was like, you have to worry about the climate crisis, because otherwise your next skiing vacation is going to be difficult, because the snow is melting or the polar bears are dying. So this is the thing when you talk about, and I think this is something which Emanuele also mentioned about historical responsibility. There have been so many NGOs working or advocating for climate debt, which has never been acknowledged. This historical responsibility has never been acknowledged. And this is what people are fighting for, because what Shrishtee was mentioning also is that we live in an unequal world, and certain populations have more power over the other population. This has been like this for many years. And so when we say something like, it doesn't matter where the ideas come from, but then you see at the end of the day, all the ideas are coming from Europe and US. So these are the things that we need to question a little bit, like, why is it coming from here, or why are certain ideas or certain people's ways of lives or thinking being considered better or being considered to be the solutions when there are so many cosmovisions existing. So yeah, this is like a short response. I will try to find the blog now and send it. And thank you for the questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Brototi and Shrishtee for addressing that issue. I'm going to give the word now to Paul, and then we're going to have a round of closing remarks to start saying goodbye. Paul?
I don't mind if this is my closing remark. Yeah, really interesting what Shrishtee was saying before, and where the ideas of degrowth come from. I kind of think of my own auntie, who had 11 children on a very small farm in Ireland. And in the space of her lifetime, it's gone from a subsistence farm, essentially, to industrialized agriculture. And as I said, she brought 11 children up on that farm. And both her and her husband, they just could not understand why their son could not take over that farm and for it to be viable. And she kind of knew it was all to do with too many things being unnatural. So that, you know, the more and more fertilizer that they needed, the more and more animal feed that they needed, all of these things were not particularly natural and grated against her soul in many ways. So I think that's replicated around the world with a lot of people living on the land. AGMs were mentioned. I think it was Brototi, and yeah, I was in the Barclays AGM last month. It was held here in Manchester. We are targeting AGMs, and I'm not sure how powerful it is. I think they're a great publicity stunt, so I'm not saying don't do them, but there might be 200 or 250 people inside that AGM, and then the following day you look at the votes, the shareholder votes, and there are people who must have tens and thousands worth of votes, and they're not at the AGM, and you see the votes, and there was over 1 million votes at the Barclays AGM. So it's good for publicity, but it doesn't really impact on the real decision makers. That's one thing that I'm thinking. And for that reason, I think that there's a new offshoot of Extinction Rebellion. It's called Just Stop Oil. And what they've done is that they've targeted oil refineries and lorries transporting oil. They're going right to the source of the growth. So to the extent that last month there were 1/3 of UK petrol stations had petrol shortages. That information was clamped down upon by the government, and it wasn't well, it was very, very briefly in the media, but not in the mainstream media. But that's what's going on, and that's, you know, I just wanted to mention that because, you know, people talk about degrowth. These people are actually going right for the source of growth, and that is fossil fuels. And yeah, we'll see another round of that coming up in the very near future, I'm sure. So on that note, they might be my closing remarks. I think they might be, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so to continue the round of closing remarks, I'm going to give you 1 minute, a minute and a half to each of you to just say what you're taking home with you after this conversation, and if you want to maybe name any other initiative or event that is happening and you want to share with the people here, this is also your chance. So Brototi, if you want to start.
So I think, well, I shared some of the events which are happening in the coming months, no? The conference in Venice, next year in Zagreb, the Degrowth International Conference. There is going to be a Degrowth Festival happening close to Vienna, also beginning of September, I think. But I would also invite all of you to be a part of another assembly, the Degrowth Assembly. And I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is the way how Shrishtee was saying that the GTA process is like it's a process and not an organization. We are trying to map all the different degrowth initiatives or people who are interested. Jean-Louis is here who can speak more about it. But basically the idea is we're trying to get people who think degrowth or are interested in thinking about degrowth either together, either they have a collective or they have a group, or they're individuals who want to engage more. And you can find information about this in degrowth.info. But the idea is to have an assembly of different movements, individuals, artists, activists, scholars, to come together and discuss about basically socio-ecological transformations together. And the book, Gabby, you're going to talk about that, no? So that's it. And thank you so much. It was very, very nice to be talking and sharing ideas with all of you.
Thank you, Brototi. Yes, I have a final announcement before you all go after the closing remarks. So wait for that. Emanuele, if you want to say something to finish.
Yeah, thank you. no, I was thinking that maybe what you unite ecological and other economist school are what Corina Dengel called maintenance economy, and I think that this is another umbrella concept, but I think it's very important, because when we focus on this reproductive concept of we can subsume all these concepts, and also take, as I was saying before, our responsibilities. And now, as appointment in Europe, there will be an European meeting, but is an international meeting. It will be held in Turin from 25 to 29 of July, and we will talk also about degrowth. Maybe it will join us also Julia Steinberg or other, I think, famous in our environment speakers. And nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Emanuele. And Shrishtee?
Thanks. Well, I first want to acknowledge that it was the Degrowth conferences where the idea of global tapestry of alternatives in many ways began being discussed, and a lot of movements came together there, and we thought it could be a good space to discuss about some of these things. And it was in Malmö Degrowth conference that we met many people, and also made a joke about how so many people are growing in degrowth conferences over the years. So yeah, I think these spaces are very important. We should keep discussing, and should keep challenging each other, critically challenging each other, so that also we learn from each other, and we grow our movements because it is so much needed, and also find our own strength and weaknesses that we can support each other in this walk that we are doing. And as the Zapatistas say, asking we walk. So we keep asking each other, how do we get better and how do we improve, and also keep walking in these paths. So I think that is important, to stand in solidarity with each other despite the differences and comments and critiques that we make. So thank you for this space, and thank you for inviting and being open to criticism. I think that's very constructive, and I had a nice time. Thanks.
Thank you, Shrishtee. I think that's a very nice place to finish this conversation. Like, the only thing we need to grow is our solidarity and our collective power. That's a good kind of organic growth that we can advocate for. So before you all leave, I just wanted to give this final announcement on the book that Brototi shared in her presentation. So the long-awaited book on degrowth and strategy will be released at the end of this month, which coincidentally, as I said, one of our panelists, Brototi Roy, wrote the foreword too. So if you want to read Brototi, you will do that in the book. The book addresses the challenging but key questions of how to realize the desired social ecological transformation that degrowth scholars and activists are working towards. For those in the audience, you can register now to get a free PDF once it's released. And you can read and learn more about the website and about the book in the website degrowthstrategy.org that you will also find in the chat. So with that, leaving you that something to look forward to, I say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much, Brototi, Emanuele, Shrishtee, Paul, and thank you to everyone here who participated, and have a nice rest of the weekend. Goodbye.